recently I came across some extraordinarily interesting chronological and historical evidence with respect to who may have actually written down the story of the Trojan War, or at least the Iliad and the Odyssey. And this is mind bending stuff here because it's not anything I knew about in any capacity, even though it's right there and even in mainstream history. It's not something that is generally ever brought up in regular historical studies. I mean, you would have to be like hardcore into Italian history to know anything about some of the stuff that we are going to discuss on this show. But the stuff that I want to discuss today it changes everything. It changes absolutely everything, not just with respect to the story of the Iliad and by extension the Odyssey, but of chronology and basic history as well. It's crazy how important the Iliad has suddenly become in my studies with trying to figure out real chronology and real history. Now, I know a lot of people really don't care about the Iliad, and I was right there with you. A year ago, had you told me that I would care about the Iliad in any real sense of the term, especially when I'm trying to figure out real history and real chronology, I would have laughed in your face, right? I would have just grabbed you by the neck and started choking you out like, and then start slapping that person, and that person would be all, you're studying the Iliad, and you just start choking them out even more. And then you throw them on the ground, then you grab them by the hair and you start smashing them into the curb, and you're like, what'd you say to me? And they're like, you're studying the Iliad, and then you just take and you start choking them with your arms. But that is basically that's how I felt about the Iliad, right? Because I'm not wasting my time studying something that has so much fictitious stuff in it and that is not dated well at all, right? That the Iliad has no really good date at all pinned to its name. So at that point you just kind of have to discard it. But what I found over the past year or so is that the Iliad has become incredibly important with respect to studies on history and chronology based on scientific evidence. And so here's the problem. Where all of the chronology and the scientific evidence has taken me is it's taken me to the Iliad. I actually have had to factor in the Iliad now into all of my chronological studies because I can't avoid it. It's weird. I didn't go out of my way to say something like, oh yeah, you know what? I think the Iliad really holds the key to understanding real history. That never crossed my mind once. There's nothing there. I never thought about it like that. The reason why I've gone towards, or not, why I'm now studying the Iliad and seeing what people are saying about it is because that's where the science has taken me. And that's it. I don't know what else to say. I have to follow evidence, and scientific evidence has shown that, hey, the Iliad actually plays a really important part in trying to figure out the real chronology of our history. All right. So I'm going to take you guys with me. All right. It's crazy. I'm not going to do this alone. So I'm going to drag every single one of you into this hellhole that has been my studies of the Iliad relative to chronology and, oddly enough, catastrophism. So one of the things that we recently covered, one of the reasons why the Iliad suddenly became important in chronological studies is because the Iliad seems to actually describe one of the catastrophic events, one of the major catastrophic events that affected Earth, only about a couple thousand years ago at most. It's not that long ago. Now, we have covered some of the catastrophism that the Iliad describes in the last show that I did, and I don't remember what the hell that one is called, but just go watch them all, and eventually you will come to the point to where we have identified the possibility that the soldiers that are taking part in these battles, they looked up to the sky and they see the gods fighting. And of course, the gods are not gods in the sense of, old dudes in robes, throwing lightning bolts at each other and tickling each other. That's not what's happening up in the sky. We replace the word god with planet, and now suddenly we have, instead of, Zeus up there with lightning bolts, we now have Jupiter up there with lightning bolts. right? A robed guy up in the sky is not scientific. However, a planetary body up in the sky throwing lightning bolts, or I should say generating electricity, is scientifically viable. And this is the kind of stuff that we read in the Iliad. This is the reason why the Iliad actually came to my attention in any shape, form, or another, because some of the parts of the Iliad are obviously fantastical. Like I said, and like everybody knows, we have to deal with the whole god situation. But once we start to replace gods with planets, suddenly what the soldiers on the battlefield are dealing with becomes not a fantastical, weird fantasy thing. It suddenly becomes a scientific possibility. So, for example, during one of the battles, we have Ares Mars, the planet Mars, who they call Ares, the god of war. We have him, quote, darkening the battlefield, unquote. Right, so if you put that in the context of just a fantastical story and a god situation, you easily just hand wave that away thinking, oh yeah, they were just writing some sort of crazy stuff. A god, I don't know, makes the battlefield dark. Yeah, sure, gods can do that. And then whatever, you keep reading and it doesn't matter. So that's generally how people will take that story. Regardless, most people will take it like that. Even if they are hardcore into studying the Iliad, stuff like that doesn't really make sense on a real physical level. I'm sure there's probably some scholars out there somewhere that has attempted to try and explain what they're meaning by the darkening of the battlefield, for example. I mean, I haven't found anybody really talking about that on the mainstream side of things, trying to somehow make that a reality. But I'm sure they're there. But the funny part about that whole situation is that for those people to try to rationalize the stuff that the gods are doing and putting it in a real world context, they're going to have to go through all kinds of convoluted explanations, right? Probably the best they could do is say something like, maybe there was an eclipse during that period of time or something, or maybe just really dark clouds. It was really bad weather that day, right? I don't know what else a mainstream person would really have access to, because, they're not operating within the realm of catastrophism, of plasma physics, of real science. They're not in that realm, so they really won't. They're not going to have a good explanation for any of it. But just because mainstream does not have an explanation for it does not mean there isn't a real scientific explanation for what is happening in the Iliad. Alright, I'm rambling. So basically, where we are at right now with respect to the Iliad and how it factors into catastrophism and chronology, and history as well, all three of these things. Where we're at right now is that it seems like the Iliad takes place during what we call the Mars event, or what I call the Mars event. I don't know if other people call it that. I'm not taking credit for that, by the way. But there's a particular catastrophic time in Earth's history to where Earth has a close encounter with the planet Mars. All right, and we're not going to go into the why it does and all and any of that. That's not for this show. All right, so I want to focus on the Iliad though. So anyway, we find that the Iliad is not only potentially valuable just as a basic historical document, but we also find value in the Iliad describing some of the catastrophic events that other cultures across the planet describe. So I find that absolutely fascinating, and that's the main reason why the Iliad has become something extremely important with respect to chronology. Now, it gets even crazier. So as we start to look into the Iliad and we start to see stuff like it recording catastrophic events, we also can then, imagine that the Iliad is indeed recording a historical event as well. And by that, I mean, the Battle of Troy. Troy is just one battle, by the way. There's a whole war going on here. It's called the Trojan War, not the Troy War. So we find ourselves in a position to where the Iliad may very well be cataloging one of the catastrophic events that we are now aware of. If the Iliad is recording that means that potentially that Trojan War situation, there might be a real historical backdrop to that as well. And by that I mean not just a backdrop, I mean that those battles actually took place. Like, these are actual historical events. If those events are real in some capacity, that means that that might be a key piece to some of the chronological puzzle, that we're trying to solve here. If we can date those battles, and if we can place where those battles took place, that will help us paint a picture of the past, obviously. There's a problem though. So here's what I've run into with respect to issues with the Iliad, and then I'm going to go into somebody that I have found that brings a completely different perspective to the writings of Homer. And this perspective actually causes us an interesting chronological situation that we have to deal with to pop up. So I want to share this with all of you because I feel it's very important. Even if you're not into catastrophism, that's fine. If you're only into chronology, this might actually be something extraordinarily crazy for you to hear, but it's all backed up by real history and by real science and by real chronology. All right, so let's get into this. What I want to cover today is I want to cover somebody who has discovered some absolutely amazing evidence with respect to who may have actually written the Iliad and the Odyssey. Now, the evidence that I'm going to present to you is not mine. I'm going to give credit to the person who does it in one sec. But I want to kind of set the stage here for the reason why this is important. I mean, obviously, trying to figure out who truly wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey is important regardless, even if the whole story is fictitious. You know what I mean? Obviously, it's important. But if the evidence that I'm about to present to you guys here right now is true, then that makes the Iliad story a completely different beast to study. And then I guess we'll have to make an entire different show to cover all that garbage. All right, so let's get into it. So the guy I want to cover today, his name is Sylvian Tristan. And he wrote a book called Redating Ancient Greece, 500 BC equals 1300 AD. This book is amazing. Covers a lot of chronological aspects of quote-unquote ancient Greece, and it shows a tremendous amount of evidence that may actually help prove that there is no such thing as an ancient Greece. That the Greece that we all know about, the Greece that we generally understand, did not exist in 500 BC. That Greece would have existed closer to, say, 1314, 1500s AD. Now, I know that sounds crazy. Don't shut it off yet, because like I said, and like everything else on this godforsaken channel, everything that I talk about is going to be backed up by history, real chronology, as real as we can get. Chronology is a bitch to understand. But ultimately, and most importantly, all of this stuff is backed up by science. So let's get into what Sylvian Tristan has to say about Homer and who Homer may have actually been. All right, let's get into this before I keep babbling about garbage. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just paraphrase a few pages out of Sylvian Tristan's book so that, you know for a fact you're not getting my interpretation. This is straight from the book. This is the evidence that the book is presenting to us. Oh, and really quick, I want to make it known that the way that this book is written, the way the author approached the problem of ancient Greece, possibly being, more of a Renaissance period, is that he comes up with that postulate, is 500 BC really 1300 AD? Like, that's the question. And the way he approaches the book is that he wants to prove that no, that's not the case. That no, 500 BC is really 500 BC and 1300 AD is truly 1300 AD. He wants to go out of his way to destroy his own hypothesis. That's how he approaches it. And that's how we should always be approaching our ideas, right? We should not pull an idea out of thin air and then just do everything we can to prove it true. It's the exact opposite. Whenever we think we have a solution to a historical or a chronological problem, the first thing we need to do is we need to attack that question playing devil's advocate. We need to look for other routes. We need to figure out ways to destroy it. And if you end up not being able to destroy your hypothesis, right, well then it can move on to the next stage, theory, and then we can go on from there. That is how you are supposed to be doing history and chronology and science, and that is not how mainstream does it nowadays. So that is why, in my opinion, no, it's a fact, not my opinion, it's a fact. That's why books like this are extremely important. All right, I'm still rambling. Let's get into it and let's see what he has to say. And then we will make unnecessary commentary after each sentence like I always do. Yes. Okay, all right. Homer is widely considered as the first epic poet of Greece, and indeed is regarded as the founder of European literature, no less. The two major epic poems that are attributed to him, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are central to European literature. Remember, don't forget, people were learning about the Iliad and the Odyssey as grade school children, all the way up until the early 1900s. I think it was maybe still taught further on, but there was a concerted effort by the government of Britain to start to get rid of the Iliad as a factual situation. Just throwing it out there, right? Now, both the Iliad and the Odyssey are both said to take place in the Mediterranean. However, there is actually no real evidence that supports this claim, and in fact, what's even more interesting is that even scholars in the supposed first millennium AD, and I mean early first millennium AD, even those scholars were purported to be questioning the location of where the Iliad and the Odyssey took place. And by that I mean they literally say, we don't think it took place in the Mediterranean. We cannot find any evidence that these two poems actually took place like here. Like that is what the people in the Mediterranean were saying back in the day. Like they actually didn't believe it either. Anyway, okay, let's keep going. All right, so according to standard view, the siege of Troy, which opposed the Achaeans, i.e. the Greeks, to Trojans took place as early as 1200 BC. But is the dating correct? Spoiler, no, it is not correct. If somebody tries to hard lock you into a date right now with respect to these poems, you have my permission to choke them out. Remember, as chronologists, we have prison rules. It's shank or be shanked. That's how we operate, and you make sure you live up to that. All right. Because so little is known about him, Homer, scholars disagree on the time when Homer lived, and some even question his very existence, and that still takes place today. Remember, not everybody is in agreement at all, even in the mainstream when it comes to the stories and the authorship of these poems. The Greek poet is said to have been blind, and is thought to have lived sometime before 650 BC, or perhaps as early as 750 to 700 BC. According to Herodotus, Homer didn't live earlier than 4 centuries before him, which means after 840 BC, in Scaligerine chronology. Remember, there's a whole problem with Homer as well. All of these writings all have chronological problems, and this is what I want to talk about. Okay, let's keep going. All right, where was I? According to Oliver Taplin, an Oxford University scholar who worked on Greek drama and also Homer, the Greek poet is largely a fiction of later times, and the historical context for the creation of these epic poems most probably corresponds to the period of 750 to 650 BC. There is no denying that Homer is central to Greek chronology. According to Herodotus, Homer and Hesiod are, quote, are the ones who taught the Greeks the descent of the gods and gave the gods their names and determined their spheres and functions and described their outward forms. That's actually one hell of a fascinating quote. He describes their spheres and functions and described their outward forms. It actually makes you wonder if they're literally talking about the ability of Plato, or not Plato, of Homer knowing that the gods were actually planets. How do you like that? Like, it's right there. Even, interesting. Anyway, another aspect which is not known is whether Homer was literate or not. In other words, did Homer actually write down the poems himself, or did he dictate them to a literate scribe? If he was blind, then yeah, obviously somebody else is going to have to write this stuff down, right? Most scholars think that Homer's poems took on a fixed written form 1 or 2 centuries after his death. See, this just goes to highlight how nobody has any real clue about what was going on with the Iliad or the creation of any of this stuff. Right? Nobody knows really anything. That's why stuff like this is going to be really important, because this question is wide open, and it's an important one to answer because we have a situation to where we have a work of supposed fiction or of possible historical value that is also talking about possible planetary catastrophism. That's why this stuff is important. And that's probably one of the main reasons why it doesn't make sense, because the mainstream is never going to focus in on and or include any kind of planetary catastrophism. So long as the mainstream historians never do this, all of ancient history is going to continue to elude them, right? I mean, there's no other way around it. Okay, where was I? They believe his poems merely existed in an oral form when Homer was alive, and that the Iliad and the Odyssey took on a fixed written form as late as the 6th century BC, roughly the mid-500s-ish BC. In any case, both poems are said to have been permanently copied and archived by a special commission created by Pisistratos. Did I get that? Pisistratos? Look, I can't read for crap, so don't get mad at me. Just bear with me. Pisistratos. I think that's how it's pronounced, right? Who is also remembered as one of the 3 tyrants of Athens, who ruled Athens from 561 to 527 BC. And today's Homeric canon is said to derive from Pisistratos' archiving. Now, we immediately have a problem right here. So if the mainstream is willing to say that Homer's story was written down during this dude's reign, Pisistratos, whatever, just don't get mad. Okay, you know what I'm talking about. You just suck it up. That's how Mr. P. We'll just call this dude Mr. P. If Homer's poems were finally written down during Mr. P's reign, that's 500 BC. So that means somehow Homer's poems have to disappear for like 1400 years or something, if we go by mainstream Scaligerine chronology. Because there's at least 1,000 years, and I'm just being nice by saying that, there's 1,000 years where Homer's poem essentially disappears. Both the Iliad and the Odyssey play no role in anything for at least 1,000 years. It's way more, obviously, but I'm just being generous. That's crazy. How the hell do you lose a huge work like this for 1,000 years? And then all of a sudden, we start talking about it again later. It's just dumb. All right. So now we're going to get into the meat and potatoes of what this book is talking about. Homer, or Omer, and Omer is spelled O-M-E-R, no H. Another peculiar aspect of Homer is the unusual character of his name. This particular name appears to be rather unique in the 3 millennia of Greek history. There seems to be only a few exceptions, and these happen to be found in the 13th century AD. At this time, a whole family bore a name which is quite close to Homer's, the Saint Omer clan, who, just like the De La Roche family, played a key role in medieval Greece between the years 1200 and 1314 AD. The St. Omer clan was a family of Frankish knights who came from what is today northern France. Greece at this time had fallen under Frankish rule and is thus often referred to as Francocratia. Godfrey of St. Omer, for example, was one of the founding members of the famed Knights Templar in 1119 AD. The Knights Templar protected pilgrims in the Holy Land during the Crusades. And we also now know that the Knights Templar situation gets pretty dark and weird as history goes on. So the fact that right here we are already possibly connecting the Iliad and the Odyssey to the Knights Templar, I mean, that's kind of telling, because the Knights Templar were not a little bitch group, right? These guys had some good power. These guys had some control over stuff, and obviously they gained more as time went on. Okay, so, just something to think about. Nicholas I of St. Omer, another Frankish knight and a member of the Fourth Crusade, Fourth Crusade being interesting because there may have only been one crusade, but we'll do a different show on that. He arrived in Greece in 1208 and became a lord in the Frankish Duchy of Athens, receiving a fief west of Thebes. Other famous members of the family in Frankish Greece include Bela of St. Omer, who received half of the city of Thebes as his domain, John of St. Omer, marshal and baron in the Greek Principality of Achaia in the Peloponnese, Nicholas II Saint of St. Omer, and Otho of St. Omer, both also lords of half of Thebes, and Nicholas III of St. Omer, hereditary marshal and of the Principality of Achaia, who was one of the most powerful and influential lords of Frankish Greece, who died in 1314 without an error, making the clan disappear. So if you have not heard of the Omer clan, there's a good reason. At some point in history, they just essentially literally vanish because the bloodline dies out. I'd be willing to bet that they changed their name and that their bloodline did not actually die out. If you're messing with the Knights Templar, the bloodline is important, right? So these guys probably still existed and continue on to this day, but probably under a completely different name. And everything I just said right there is completely coming out of my butt. So I don't know if that's true, but I would believe it. I mean, you know, like how, okay, you know all about the Knights Templar, you know what's up. All right. Is it possible that one member of this family was the Homer we are looking for? As we have seen, Homer is supposed to have lived around 750 to 650 BC. A 1800-year chronological shift would redate Homer's life to around 1050 AD, just a few decades before Godfrey of St. Omer sailed to the Holy Land, or 1150 AD. Just a few decades before the arrival of the St. Omer family in Greece, depending on which date, 750 or 650 BC, we decide to retain. Now, really quickly, one of the postulates of this book, well, I mean, literally the title of the book is that there is an 1800-year non-existent chunk of history that has been added to mainstream history, right? So what I mean by that, I know that didn't make sense. Okay. So what I mean by that is that the years from 500 BC to 1300 AD relative to Greek history never existed. All of that stuff in there that, well, I mean, we don't have a lot of stuff between all of that anyway, right? There's the whole Greek Dark Age, there's a whole bunch of garbage in there, but all of that stuff is just cope for trying to make up an entire fictitious 1800 years. Now, I realize that is going to be tough to grasp. I'm not going to get into too much depth here, but that is one of the things that this book, and other people as well, it's not just this book, this is not the only schizo out there, right? The 1800-year artificial inclusion of Greek history is being recognized more and more today. And the reason why is simple. Scientifically speaking, we have no reason to believe that the years between 500-ish BC and 1300-ish AD ever happened with respect to Grecian history. Now, like I said, I know it's crazy, but just bear with me. But that's kind of the premise right now. So, here we go. Even more intriguing, Homer's poems are supposed to have taken on a fixed written form in the middle of the 6th century BC, which means that perhaps Homer did live at a later time than earlier, merely writing down poems that had remained exclusively oral until then. Essentially, the falsification of history would have created the myth of a Homer living earlier than he actually did. Now, taking in the mid-6th century BC and applying an 1800-year chronological shift takes us to the mid-13th century AD, the exact time when the St. Omer clan ruled over Frankish Greece. Is it possible that the real Homer was actually a member of the St. Omer family? Is it possible that the real Homer was actually a member of the St. Omer family who had the famous oral epic written down by a scribe at the time. The Achaeans. It is also interesting to note that in Homer's poem The Iliad, Greeks are mostly referred to not as Greeks or Hellenes, but Achaeans. I always find this amazing, and the reality is, and he might say it in this book, but I don't believe the term Greek, that term did not appear, I think, until the 1700s. So it might sound like a trivial situation, but that matters. Because when we start saying that the Greeks existed back in like 500 BC and nobody called themselves the Greeks, should we be talking like that? What kind of problems does that cause for people if they think Greeks lived during a time when there was no such thing as Greeks, right? It gets weird. Okay, anyway. It's just something really crazy to think about because back in the day, nobody was calling themselves Greeks. They would call themselves the Achaeans. So it's really important to probably use the term that the people back in the day applied to themselves, even if the term Greek is applied to their later ancestors. I mean, you cause too many temporal problems by using the incorrect terminology during a period or a very certain temporal period of time. Temporal period, it's like I don't need to say that. That's a double positive. Shut up. All right, let's keep going. The name, the Achaeans, the name appears to be used no less than 598 times, whereas the other two names used in the poem, Argives and Danaans, are only used 29 and 138 times respectively. Why are Greeks called Achaeans? The reason why it is so is that in ancient times, Achaea supposedly referred to the whole of Greece, which means that Achaeans were Greeks. Later on, there was a change. The region called Achaea restricted itself to the northernmost region of the Peloponnese. Under the Romans, there was another change. Achaea covered once more the whole of the Peloponnese, as well as part of eastern and northern Greece. After the fall of Rome, though, there was another change, as Achaea came to design once more the small regional unit situated in the northern Peloponnese. In the 13th century AD, there was a new change as Franks created a Principality of Achaea, which comprised most, if not all, of the Peloponnese. By the term Frank, one should mainly understand Burgunds coming from what is now northeastern France, although the term more generally applies to the occupants of Athens in the 14th and 15th centuries as well, i.e. the Catalans and the Florentines. The Principality of Achaea was founded by the Frankish knights William of Champlitte and Geoffrey of Villehardouin in the year 1205 AD, during the Fourth Crusade. After that, there was another change, and until this very day, Achaea has once more been designing a fairly small regional unit of Greece located in the northernmost part of the Peloponnese. This succession of changes is truly striking and utterly strange. Let's recap. Basically, this is the ridiculous chronology that we find when it comes to Greece, and this is going to be relevant to trying to understand who Homer really was. So, in Greek chronology, this is what we find. Okay, so we find Greeks living in the Peloponnese and beyond. Okay, so Greeks are chilling in the Peloponnese. Then the Greeks are only living in the northernmost part of the Peloponnese. Then we have Greeks and Romans living in the Peloponnese and beyond again. Then we have Greeks living only in the northern part of the Peloponnese again. Then again we have the Greeks and the Franks living in a principality covering most or all of the Peloponnese. And then, last but not least, we find the Greeks once again living only in the northernmost part of the Peloponnese. So basically, history appears to have repeated itself, not just once, but twice. Numbers 1 and 2 are identical to numbers 3 and 4, and are also identical to numbers 5 and 6. Basically, what he's illustrating here is that history is oddly repeating itself, not just once, but twice. So we have a situation to where the Greeks are only known to be in the northern part of the Peloponnese, and then suddenly they're the entire Peloponnese, and then once again down the line they're only in the northern part, and then once again a little later they're the entire thing. Then they go back to being only the little part of it, right? It's really weird that that happens. Now, is this impossible? Like, no, of course it's not impossible, but it's very odd that we find the exact duplicate twice, not just one duplicate, but two duplicates of historical events repeating themselves in the chronology. Now, that might not sound like too big of a deal, but if we have multiple duplicates in chronology and those duplicates are fake, there is a huge repercussion from this, and that repercussion is that we have to now add hundreds, if not thousands of years to account for the other duplicates. So basically, those events may never have happened, and if they didn't happen, there shouldn't be an extra 1800 years in Grecian history. But there is an extra 1800 years because we have to account for the garbage injected into Grecian history due to Scaliger and all of his buddies, right? So, like, that's crazy. I mean, we now have added hundreds, if not over 1,000 years of time that never existed, right? So this is a problem. This is a legitimate issue, and what he's pointing out here is a legitimate point of contention. Why do we find not just one duplicated history in Greece, but multiple duplicates, right? And we'll cover more of that later, but what he's doing is he's setting the stage for who could have actually been Homer and how Homer may have been truly Greek, but lived in a completely different time. Because if all of those other duplicated time periods aren't real, that means Homer could not have existed in 500 BC, or whenever the BC era people want to say he existed in. Because those years never existed. That necessarily throws him into the AD range. And that is what he is setting up. All right, I'm going to skip around a little bit because there is a ton of information, and he really sets up the picture to support the claim that Homer lived in the AD time period in the 13th century. So we got some of that now, so let's go more back into the Homer stuff. All right, so it is extremely interesting to note that the time gap between the 6th century BC and the 13th century AD is a neat 1800 years. Don't forget, this 1800 year time gap appears all over the place with respect to Franco-Grecian history and ancient Greek history. This is a legitimate number, and I believe Fomenko discovered it as well. Anyway, we can actually test this, and we'll do that on a different show. But there appears to be a legitimate 1800 years added to our chronology that never existed. All right, let's keep going. Is it possible that Homer's Achaeans were in fact Achaeans living in the Frankish principality of Achaea in the 13th century AD? Could Homer have been a member of the Saint Omer clan who became blind during a medieval battle, for instance? Last but not least, is it possible that the Trojan War was a war fought by Frankish Greece as late as the 12th or 13th century AD? In other words, was the Trojan War part of what is today remembered as the Crusades? If so, what is known as the Greek Dark Ages, dated between the 12th and the 8th centuries BC, were much shorter than usually thought, or even non-existent. Nicholas III of St. Omer built a castle in 1311 in southwestern Greece, the Castle of St. Omer, today known as the Centimeri Castle. It is now in ruins. This is of course pure conjecture, but is this castle in any way connected to the blind bard who once dictated or wrote down the Iliad and the Odyssey, not in the 6th century BC, but perhaps as late as the 13th century AD? How do you like that? There's a completely different spin for you with respect to who Homer may have actually been and when he may have actually lived. All right, we're going to keep going, and then we'll start to get close to wrapping this up, and we'll go over the main bullet points at the end. All right, so last section, blind bard. Let us come back to the 13th century AD. The St. Omer clan owes its name to the town of St. Omer, which is today situated in the northernmost part of France. Godfrey of St. Omer, one of the founders of the Order of the Knights Templar, was part of the family of the Lords of St. Omer. The town is located about 20 miles away from the North Sea. The town of St. Omer apparently owes its name to a canonized bishop known as St. Omer, a Burgundy-born bishop who allegedly died in 670 AD. Oddly enough, St. Omer protects people who have eyesight problems. The reason why it is so is that St. Omer apparently spent the last years of his life, guess what? A blind man. Keeping in mind Fomenko's assertion that recorded history does not predate the 10th century AD, St. Omer could not have lived in the 7th century AD. He must be the phantom duplicate of someone who lived later. Is it possible that the original character whom Christian tradition built on is the same man who wrote or dictated Greek's most famous epic poems? Is it possible that he was a blind member of the St. Omer family who lived in Frankish Greece? Now, something really quick that I didn't really cover here. One of the problems, or one of the things that has been discovered with respect to real chronology, is that it's becoming more and more apparent that there have been phantom duplicates of real events that took place in the AD time period that have been duplicated or triplicated or even quadruplicated in some cases, and they have all been sent back, hundreds if not thousands of years back into the chronological scale. Now, this is what Scaligerrian chronology is essentially based on. It's based on a lot of these apparent duplicates. Now, we'll get into the whole duplicate thing later, but the duplicate thing matters because if all of these duplicates have also affected Greek history, which they have completely, which this guy sets up a really good case for in the book as well, and there's tons of other people that do it as well. If that's the case, then that means that Homer could not have existed 500 or 650 BC. He has to be in the 1300-ish AD time frame. Now, I get it. I understand that this might sound insane. But when you start to look at it scientifically and just using common sense and very basic critical thinking skills, there's way too many problems with Homer existing, 5 or 600 BC era. There's too many problems having the actual events taking place, even further back in the BC time period. If all of those events took place way back then and Homer existed way back then, we really run into a question of how the hell did all of these stories survive to today's period of time? Because we know for a fact that there is at least 1,000-year period to where we don't have the story. Nobody references the story. Nobody's telling it so far as we can tell. It just doesn't exist. And of course, this also follows the trend of all kinds of other things miraculously disappearing as well when it comes to things that we generally attribute to ancient Greeks. Stuff like crazy high-level philosophical works or, all kinds of crazy mathematical stuff or physics. The Greeks are credited with all kinds of amazing discoveries, basically. And then all of those discoveries miraculously disappear for, over 1,000 years. And then suddenly everybody picks right back up where the Greeks left off. There is no evidence of any kind of rebuilding in between. It's just there's a point in time where the Greek period ends. There's a dark age that lasts for a while, and then suddenly everybody decides to pick right back up where they left off, and they can do it, and there's no problem. That's a problem, right? That defies all logic. It makes zero sense if you think about it longer than 2 seconds, right? So we have a legitimate problem. So while I understand that at first, the Homer existing in the 1300s AD and being called Omer That might sound crazy, but it follows all of the evidence. Like this, once again, this theory is not being pulled out of thin air. This theory is being arrived at due to the chronological evidence, the scientific evidence, archaeological evidence, real historical evidence. We have no choice but to head in this direction. So the question of when did Homer actually exist? When was the Iliad actually created? Is no longer, the answer no longer takes place in the BC time period. It makes much more sense to put Homer in the 1300-ish AD area. And there's other reasons for this as well with respect to the battles that happened. So the other part of this is that, or the other question that we can now ask is, all right, fine, Homer lived in the 1300s AD. When the hell did the Iliad and the Odyssey take place? And by all accounts, we are starting to find that the Iliad may be recording the only crusade that actually happened. Right, we're all familiar with the Crusades, right? There's like 4 of them, I think, or something like that. But when we start to look back in history and we start to really look at the evidence, we start to find that there's probably only one crusade. And that crusade may actually be the Trojan War. Now, that's a different show entirely, but if that's the case, that means that if this Omer clan guy wrote the Iliad, that makes more sense. Because he would have been writing about something that he would have been able to, physically see. He would have understood how to write those battles, how to write all of that stuff during his period of time. The weirder part about this whole thing is that, of course, this then calls into question the possibility of the Iliad recording a catastrophic event. So right now, when we look at the Iliad, we kind of get the feeling that they are talking about the Mars event, when Mars had a close encounter with Earth. However, it doesn't seem like that event would have taken place, around the 1200s AD. It seems the evidence points that the Mars event would have happened a couple of thousand years ago at least. So why are we finding Omer talking about Ares, Mars, Pallas Athene up in the sky fighting? Why do we find this as part of the story? And what is the author actually talking about when he talks about the gods affecting Earth, right? Because it's not just, Ares darkening the sky. We actually have records in the Iliad of the Earth, tilting a little bit geomagnetically on its axis, right? It's shifting the latitude by 3-ish or 4-ish degrees. Like, they actually discuss that in the Iliad as well. There are lines in there. They're almost kind of throwaway lines, but so that's my problem with the catastrophe part. Because if we date the Iliad in 650 BC, then the Mars event makes more sense. We don't have an exact date, by the way, but then that catastrophe makes more sense. If that event is, if the Iliad is recording, I don't know, man. That's the problem, because at that point in time in the 1300s AD, we're pretty damn sure that the planets were essentially already stuck in their courses. Nobody's worried about, Venus or Mars or Saturn or Jupiter. Nobody was worried about any of these planets. They don't show up in writing slapping people around like they used to way back in the day. So this is my problem. Is Velikovsky correct in pointing out that the Iliad is actually recording one of these cosmological events? Once again, there's no massive destruction or anything. They just talk about stuff happening up in the sky that matches what other cultures would have been talking about. But the difference is that in the Iliad, there's no massive tidal waves, there's no huge earthquakes, there's no, meteors are not falling from the sky. There's nothing insane going on, right? That all the other stories have all that insanity going on, and that's exactly what we would expect if there was some kind of planetary catastrophe happening. We don't really see that in the Iliad at all. So my issue now is the Iliad actually describing the Mars event, or is it describing maybe something else that was going on back then that was not as catastrophic? If it was just, man, I don't know, dude. This is the problem, because there's stuff in the Iliad that really does reference exactly what happened during the Mars event. So this is why the Iliad has become important to me and also annoying, because there's a lot of good scholarship nowadays that really points towards the Iliad recording one of the main planetary catastrophe events, possibly. But then at the same time, chronology is showing us that the Iliad may have actually been written and happened in, the 13th, 12th century AD. So, this is one of the main problems that I'm starting to run into, because chronology changes everything. So, people who are trying to figure out the catastrophism side of things, the majority of them, unfortunately, are using the mainstream chronology. And if you use the mainstream chronology, you get more ancient dates for things, which works really well for catastrophism. However, when we start to look at real chronology, we find stuff like the Iliad maybe not have been, didn't exist back in the BC era. It existed in the relatively recent AD era. And we know that, or at least we're pretty damn sure, like 99% sure, I would say, that the majority of the catastrophic events that took place that Earth would have went through with respect to, all the cosmology at the time, took place, at least, a couple thousand years ago plus. So that's the problem with the Iliad, but it's undoubted that the Iliad does indeed talk about some sort of a cosmological event going on up in the sky, and those cosmological events do affect, what's going on Earth. I mean, there's plenty of descriptions of things happening in the sky that affect, the battlefield and the people on Earth. So that's the question. What the hell are they talking about? The other problem that we run into here, because right now you could play devil's advocate and you could say, well, yeah, what if it was just a minor thing going on? Because the reality is, if the Earth had gone through a cosmological car wreck, the debris would be, there would be a lot of debris, and there would be a lot of debris flying around, even though through electrical principles, the debris would self-organize really quickly. It would still take a second. So even our ancestors just 1,000 years ago, they still would have been seeing stuff in the sky. Nothing like the people a few thousand years ago would have seen, but they still would have been accustomed to seeing stuff going on up in the sky. More comets, for example, more meteor showers, things like that. They would have been a witness to more of those kinds of simpler cosmological events. But if the Iliad takes place in the 1300s, we would still have maybe some debris hanging around. And it's known that even during this period of time, even if you look at the mainstream, history, for whatever reason, there is a lot of comets flying around back during that time. So my question now becomes, when Homer says Ares, and he talks about Pallas Athene, and he talks about Apollo, and he talks about, Zeus and all this stuff, are they referencing the actual planets at this point in time? Or in the 1300s AD, have things kind of changed to where if Homer existed in the 1300s, he had really no connection with the people and their experiences, 1,000 plus years ago, which would make sense. But if he doesn't have that kind of a connection, he might know the names of these things, but they may not be attributing these names to the original planets. They might be attributing these names to other cosmological bodies that they see up in the sky, right? So it could have been a comet that did something instead of Mars. So Ares might not actually be the planet Mars. It might actually be some sort of cometary body. When they talk about Pallas Athene up there, it could have been two cometary bodies, not planetary size, smaller ones, but big enough to affect Earth to some degree or another. See, I don't know, man. This is the problem. Either way, this is evidence that everybody has to contend with, regardless of whatever particular theory you like or are going for. I mean, this is the kind of things we have to be honest about. So I do believe that there have been major catastrophes that have hit this planet, and this is according to, scientific evidence and, histories. But we have to be careful with things like this, because we find a situation to where something we may have thought was a couple thousand years old may not be that old at all. And if it's not that old at all and it's referencing cosmological events, then that kind of mixes stuff up. So yeah, you know what? It also it makes me wonder. Oh yeah, by the way, so for those of you maybe who have not picked up on it yet, if Saint Omer or Homer, whatever, was living in the 1300s AD, that means the Greece that you are aware of generally in the mainstream existed during that time period. It did not exist in 500 BC. There was never anything like what the mainstream portrays Greeks as. Right? So all those movies that we watch with people with togas, it's all garbage. Right? The real Greeks of ancient history, they wore medieval attire, right? They wore the same attire that everybody else wore in the 1300s. These people were not, weird toga wearing people with, leaves in their hair or whatever the hell they depict these people as. All right, so that's another part of this thing. Oh, which begs the question. So that's the thing. Where did they get the gods' names from then? All right, so we're going off point. I want to stick with Homer. Okay, so this has gone long enough. We have a lot of problems that we have to figure out, but the perspective is interesting, isn't it? Because if Homer existed in the 1300s AD, that means that it's entirely possible that the Iliad and the Odyssey took place, in the 1200s, 1300s AD, which completely changed the historic landscape, or changes the historic landscape. I mean, it changes everything, right? It throws a wrench into all of our... Anyway, so here, let's recap really quick, and then I'm going to shut up and stop this garbage. All right, so the main points of what we covered. Homer is said to have lived in the 8th to 6th century BC, and his famous poems probably took on a fixed form in the 6th century BC. That is what the mainstream supposes. The only people who bore the name similar to Homer's in the last 3,000 years of Greek history are the members of the Saint Omer clan in the Frankish Greece of the 13th century AD. That's fascinating. It's funny how just a little piece of information like, why is nobody else named Homer anywhere else in Greece, right? There's not just one John, right? There's not just one Jose in the world. There's tons of these people. Why is it that we find Homer is the only person that has this name? That's very, very suspicious. Very suspicious, actually. Like that's a huge data point against mainstream history. Very simple data point, but a big one. All right, so the time interval between Homer and the St. Omer clan is 1,800 years. That's the important number. That's one of the main time gaps that we find in ancient chronology. Both Homer and St. Homer, a canonized bishop hailing from the St. Omer's clan hometown, were blind. All right, so both authors were blind. Homer called the Greeks the Achaeans. And 1,800 years later, the Franks founded the Principality of Achaia. Basically, in both periods of time, these people would have been considered Achaeans, not Greeks, in their own, time periods. Right, so Homer's poems are supposed to have been completely forgotten for more than a millennium in the West, and first translated into Latin as late as the 14th century AD. And the ironic thing about this is that we find suddenly a magical amount of Greek tomes suddenly being translated into Latin around this time period. So, Homer's works fall right into line with all the other, stuff going on at this point in time with respect to translations and being magically found, right? So Homer's stuff is right in there. Which also begs the question, is this really talking about a real event at all? It's also possible that, what Homer was writing about was indeed a complete fiction, or more or less a fictitious story that may have borrowed a little bit from the current time he lived in, i.e., if there was a crusade going on, some sort of a big war, he would have known about it, maybe even took place in it, or maybe even fought in it, I don't know. But he knew about it, but then he wrote a grandiose story about it using that kind of a situation as the backdrop. And then for the whole God situation, for all I know, he had access to real ancient tomes with respect to the Mars event, and maybe he integrated the Mars event from way back in the day from works that he had that we no longer have access to, and he added those to his mostly fictitious story. I don't know. See, that's also another possibility. This is the issue that we run into, and it's the problem that a lot of people aren't calling out. They don't even know to call it out. They don't even realize these are real problems. All right, anyway, so we have those as problems. All right, last one. Homer's poems were translated into modern languages such as Italian or English in the late 16th century AD only. This is important because in the 16th century, this is where we start to have Scaligerrian chronology come into play. It starts to not take over, but it starts to become not quite mainstream, but it starts to gain ground. So if you have this translation happening around the same time that Scaliger is doing his garbage, that means it could have been affected by Scaligerrian chronology. By that I mean the translation could have been changed to fit with whatever Scaliger was talking about at the time. So that's another possibility to where we may not actually have the original poem. Saint Omer may have written the Iliad and the Odyssey, but whatever his original writings were, we may not have anymore because they fell into the hands of the Renaissance writers and translators. And when they get a hold of stuff, well, we know what they do, right? They falsify, they make up, they delete, they destroy. That's what they do to works. So it is entirely possible that the Iliad that we know now, or not even possible, it's fact actually, because when the Iliad was translated to English, even if you go back to the 1600s, you can find people complaining about the translation itself. They don't like the original, they don't like the way it's been translated, but nobody changed it, right? So it was just like, well, we don't like the translation, and not everybody, but there were scholars out there that said, hey, it's a bad translation. This is not how it was. This is not good. But, they were basically shoved to the side. Right? That's what happens in mainstream, right? If somebody says anything that the mainstream does not like, you are immediately discarded. And that's exactly what happened, we know for a fact, with the Homeric poems. So when we read the Homeric poems in English, we are not getting the original. That's just the truth. Even if it was done as faithfully as possible, we would never have the original, right? Because translations, you can only translate so much accurately. There's going to be fudging in there regardless, whether we like it or not, right? So, but if you have Scaligerrian people messing with it as well, things get a little muddy, and we run into some serious problems. So far as I know, there could, all the God stuff that's in there, that could have been added at a later date as well. I don't know. All right, so that's basically what's going on here. So it's entirely possible that Homer lived in the 13th century AD and, is describing events that took place during or around his time period. Yeah, all right, I'm done talking. I got stuff to do. You need to go do something with your life.